My name is Louise Swinn. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to the elders of any other communities who may be with us today. And to acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. So today we have the great pleasure of Vicki Laveau-Harvie. I'm going to give her the introduction hopefully she deserves. Vicki Laveau-Harvie was born in Canada but lived for many years in France before settling in Australia. She has 3 passports and treasures the unique perspective this quirk of fate affords her. In France, she worked as a translator and a business editor, despite being a specialist in 18th century French literature. In Sydney, she lectured in French studies at Macquarie University. After retiring, she taught ethics in a primary school. Vicki is passionate about writing, education and communication. Her memoir, The Erratics, won the 2018 Finch Memoir Prize and last week the 2019 Stella Prize. And I was one of the judges, and this book is really why I read books. It has everything: pathos, humour, a real story, language play, characters that teach me about myself, historical and philosophical musings. I could go on and on. If you've not read it yet, you're in for such a treat. Please make Vicki very welcome. So, Vicki, when the Stella shortlist was announced, as chair of judges, I did quite a few press interviews, and a few journalists who'd kind of looked up The Erratics couldn't really find that many reviews about it. I mean, there were a few mentions, but it's safe to say that at that point it was a quiet sort of underachiever. And to me, the quality of this book was evident from page 1. So I'm interested in whether or not the publishing of this book has been the roller coaster ride that it seems to have been, like from the outside.
Oh, it's been whitewater rafting from the beginning to the end. It has. It's been exhilarating, but there have been ups and downs, yes.
Yes, okay. And I mean, it's a nice way of putting it, whitewater rafting. Certainly, I can imagine that, because obviously the book went out of print.
It did,
and then got picked up by a big publisher.
Months, yes.
Yes, after 6 months.
And that was disappointing.
Yeah.
I was not happy because...
Really?
Well, no, I wasn't.
No, I can imagine.
I wanted a little more life for the book.
Yeah.
And now it has it, so that's wonderful.
Because I guess when you write a book, you want readers.
Well, yes, you do. And I became aware after it was published that more than I had expected, there were kind of universal things underneath the book.
Yeah.
The problems of family, of mental illness in families, of dysfunction in families, of sibling rivalry, of bad climate, all kinds of things. And that people who would contact me would relate to different things in the book, and much more so than I expected. So that was very gratifying, and I was very pleased to think that perhaps the book had found readers who found something in the book that they could relate to. And in particular, one of the things I think that pushed me to write the book was the idea that even when a situation looks really, really dire, there are funny things or touching things, or there's something in there that is a little bit redeeming, that allows you to hang on until you get a little bit out of the white water. So, yeah.
So you do get contacted by readers?
Yes, I have.
Has that been happening more and more? What kinds of things do they want to share of their stories?
Something I've heard quite often is, it's usually online, people writing to me, and they say, this could be my story, because we all have families. And I think the definition of family is difficult, That's what a family is. It wouldn't be a family otherwise, and that doesn't mean that it isn't satisfying and gratifying and wonderful sometimes. My family of origin wasn't usually those good things. Occasionally it was. But everyone can relate to something. And a number of people writing have said, this is my story. And I thought, to an extent, it's the story of everyone. Because we have mothers, we have sisters.
Yeah.
We have problems, we get older, our parents get older. there are problems. We don't live in a society that makes room for older people and has a framework for how to welcome older people in, or not welcome, but keep them in the community as people who are contributing. You get put to the side the older you get. So I understand the resonance. Yes, it's actually quite wonderful.
I mean, that's the highest compliment, really, isn't it? To be told, this is my story. That's how much I relate to your books,
yes.
Even though it's not my story at all.
It's lovely. It brings tears to my eyes every time. It really does. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting what you were saying about the sort of trials of older people. I mean, we have this society and we're told it's ageing. There's lots of people who are moving into that. And it's funny how we talk about these sort of older people and putting them in institutions or aged care. And it's just that they're fit into this kind of category of older people, as if they're all kind of one type of person. And yet, as shown in your book and with all of the people that we know, of course this is just as broad an array of personalities as exist in the rest of the world, and trying to put them into institutions is inherently very difficult. What do you think that we need to be doing better or understanding more to fit around that?
I'm always surprised when people who are younger meet an older person and say, gee, they were an engineer, or she was a can-can dancer or something, as though it were absolutely unbelievable that this older person who's sitting there knitting ever did anything else with her life. We were people before we got older, and we still are. There's a church near where I live, and I was driving down the highway one day, and they have a board out the front, and on the board it said, meeting for over 60s, I think it was, or maybe it was over 70s. Anyhow, it was my age group. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, and maybe they're going rock climbing or something. And underneath it said, knit and natter. And I thought, just shoot me right now, because that's not what I'm going to be doing. I can't knit, and I natter, I guess I do. But
Your granddaughter agrees you do natter. There's a good big laugh there.
I hear you. I can't see you, but I hear you.
So obviously this is your first book, as we've heard quite a lot, but how have you considered yourself a writer through your life, and how long have you been writing?
I've always written, I think. I never found it difficult to write. When I was in school, when they'd say, 200-word composition on what you did over the summer, usually what happened in my family over the summer was pretty florid. I mean, there was crazy stuff going on, so I had to tame it down a little bit, but I had material. It was okay. And, my neighbor in the desk would be writing about how he painted his uncle's garage or something, and I'm thinking, I got it over you. But that wasn't necessarily a good thing. However, it was never a problem. I could put together a composition. I went to university, I wrote essays, I wrote a thesis, then I wrote another thesis, and then I had jobs where I wrote. And I've always written. I took up creative writing when I was about 35 or 40, and I've been writing creative nonfiction, fiction, poetry since. I'm just not very good at sharing it. Yeah.
Okay, so at what kind of level does it have to be at for you to feel comfortable sharing it?
I'm not uncomfortable. My focus is kind of on the process, because I really, really love to write. I mean, my favorite thing is sitting there in the pajamas with cows on them, at my desk with a pen and I spend a lot of time in stationery stores. Because I write by hand. I think really the brain and the heart, they're connected to the page by the pen. I can't write on a screen. Lots of people can. Yeah. I wish I could go faster, but I can't. It's not the way I do it. And that's when I'm happy. And I think because what I like to do, and I think it's kind of the process when you write poetry, is I like to find something that I hadn't noticed or that has a meaning that I hadn't developed. And I like to dig down, and that's best done in pajamas, definitely, at your desk. And I like the idea that when you write poetry, everything you put on the page opens out onto a constellation of other meanings, because that's what poetry is. Everyone reads a poem differently. And I love that idea that you can put something on a page which can have multiple meanings for different people, perhaps, if you're lucky, and if you do it right. So it's the doing it right that I'm really interested in, and not so much the putting it in an envelope and thinking, where do I send this? Because I just kind of don't do that.
I don't think you're going to have too much problems with where will I send this anymore. Hopefully you'll be willing to. But so, I mean, obviously creative writing, this is very creative, and you do have lots and lots of stories. I'm interested in what the decision was around making the Erratics a memoir. I mean, did you ever think about it being fiction?
No. And there's quite a funny comment from one of my neighbours to whom I had told parts of my story during this 6-year period, which is covered in the book, when I went back often to Canada and spent 2 or 3 weeks at a time trying to help my father when my mother had been hospitalized. And I was telling my friend, we were out walking, and I was telling her some of the things that happened. And she said, well, you know, you should write this down. And I said, yeah, maybe. And she said, but you can't write it as fiction, because they're going to say to you, this couldn't happen. You know, she said, you'll have to do it as a memoir. And she wasn't wrong, because memoir, you've got a contract with your reader. I mean, it is personal, it is your take on the reality, but I think you have a duty, if you're going to write memoir, to tell the absolute truth to the best of your ability. And it will be your truth. You're not writing biography. You're not checking how many people were on the train the day you took the train. Not that kind of thing, but it has to be the truth of the heart of the matter. And you owe that to your reader, and you must do it. And I think if you read memoir, if the writer has not had that pact with his reader or her reader, you can feel it. You really need that honesty on the page.
Did you ever feel like you wanted to exaggerate and you had to stop yourself?
No. As I say, I had material. I figured the best way to serve the material I had was just to put it down the way it was, because sometimes that was florid enough, you know? I didn't need to tone it up. I kind of needed to go the other direction.
Do you feel like you did need to tone it down?
No, I tried to tell it straight.
Straight as...
I told it straight, to the best of my ability.
Can you tell me about when the Erratics as a title settled, when you decided that that was just right for this book?
Well, that was a huge piece of luck. You know, when you're a writer, occasionally you're reading a cereal box or something, and you've got this idea, it's kind of, you know, just floating in your head. It's not defined, and you're just, you know, irritated because you can't get a hold of it. And then there's a phrase or a word, you read it somewhere, you hear it in the street, somebody on the bus is discussing something, and you've got it. That's the idea. You need the word, you need this thing to get you started. Well, one day, when I'd gone back to Canada and I was driving near the place where my father's property was, I was driving down this country road in this beautiful setting in the Rocky Mountain foothills. And there's a thing called the Erratics train. Now, the Erratics are big geological, well, they're boulders. And they were deposited down the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains from Alaska down into Montana, so through all of Alberta in Canada, down into the US. And this big glacier came down many millions of years ago. I won't try to say how many because I'll get it wrong, but millions. It came down the Rockies, and it deposited, when it melted a bit, these very large boulders, not Ayers rock, but big, quite big. And every once in a while it would deposit one, and these are called erratics. That's the name of this kind of rock that gets deposited by a glacier. And the little town near where my father's property was is called Okotoks. And there was a sign on the side of the road. And I'm driving along, and we're trying to untangle legal and financial and medical and terrible dilemmas for my parents. My sister and I are. I'm driving along, and on the side of the road is a sign, and it says, "Visit the Okotoks Erratic." And I thought, I am. You know, I actually am. And I thought, as a writer, I had to stop the car. I thought, this is such a gift. I mean, I absolutely have to write this book because that just fell on me, you know. Yeah. There's a thing called the Erratics train, and it's this large number of boulders deposited every 300 or 400 miles down the inside of the Rockies. Yeah. So that's where the title came from.
Yeah, I bet you just didn't think twice once that was
No.
decided.
It was just, serendipity. I thought, okay, I've got it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the happenings that took place were in 2007, which of course is 12 years ago now. I'm interested in what the distance of time gave you in the writing.
Well, I began to write it about halfway in the middle of that 6-year period. So my mother broke her hip in 2007 and was hence removed from the house where she had isolated herself and my father in the country for quite some time. And so she was hospitalized, and she would be for quite a while. It was a bad break. There'd be rehab. And about 3 years into the 6-year period where we dealt with, first of all, getting my father back on his feet because he was very unwell. We didn't realize, but my mother had actually been starving him. I thought he was terminally ill. When I first saw him, he was very thin and his mind was very foggy. In that first 3.5-week period, my sister and I cooked and fed him, and I think he gained 13 kilos over that period. So he had been just gradually wasting away, and what was more wonderful was that his mind came back. He wasn't, I thought he was perhaps demented. He wasn't. He was just starving. So, yes.
So the amount of time that you've had since then, I guess, did you start writing it while it was happening?
Yes, so about 3 years in the 6-year period, I began writing it down. And then I finished the book when my mother died in 2013.
Oh, okay.
I had almost finished. I had about 2 or 3 chapters left to write, and I was pondering how to finish the book. I had some ideas, and then with her passing, I found another way to finish the book.
Are you a fast writer when you write?
I wrote this in about maybe 20 months, 18 to 20 months. Yeah. I write a lot in my head when I'm stomping around in my neighborhood, so I don't know what my neighbors think of me because I walk by muttering, you know, so it's probably not good.
Stomping and muttering.
Stomping and muttering, yes. And I usually go out at dusk. I'm kind of a vampire. I don't like sunlight. So I come out from under my desk about when the sun goes down, and I go out walking. And
do you change out of the cow pajamas?
Oh, yes. I don't usually go out in the cow pajamas.
It would be great.
I've not been known to. I could. I might start.
Well, you can do anything now.
Yeah, I guess so.
One of the things that I kept thinking of when I was reading was the choices that we often have to make between two things, neither of which is in any way perfect.
Yes.
And I feel as though there are times in this book in which you offer advice to how we can, not overtly, because that's not how you write, but advice as to how to take, which of these two roads to take. How do you make those sort of moral and ethical and sort of practical decisions for yourself?
Well, this was interesting, actually, and it was part of, I think, the structure of the book, because it's a lot about my sister, who was also someone I hadn't seen very much of. We were both, my mother decided 20 years before the story to disinherit us legally and disown us, which you can do legally. So we weren't really allowed to get in touch or anything. So we'd seen little of them, but by the same occasion, my sister lives in Canada and I live in Australia, so we'd seen little of each other also. This meant that when we were together for several weeks at a time, several times a year, looking to help my father, we had very different viewpoints on how to do things. And the first time we went, and we were speaking on the phone, and I said, okay, I'm going to come, and we're going to deal with this crisis at that point, the beginning of the thing. My sister said, look, and this is a great occasion. just when I pick you up at the airport, then we're driving out to the property and we'll just stop at the mall and we'll rent a couple of carpet cleaners and you and I can do the whole house because it hasn't been done for years. And I said, no. I'm coming from Australia to try and help with what is basically, there's a crisis happening. There's, Dad is sick and alone and who knows what's going on. Mum's in the hospital. She's very unwell. Who knows what's going on. We've got to figure all this out. I'm not cleaning carpets, but my sister is very, very practical. And I think it was a way of dealing with the anxiety was by saying, okay, they're going to be clean carpets to start with, but I just said, I haven't come all this way to, shampoo a Berber blend. I'm not doing it. It's just not going to happen. And anyhow, I'm allergic to everything. So really, no, it's not going to happen. I found that that's part of what I wanted to write in the book, was that we did manage to come to decisions, even though she saw things one way and I saw things another. She has a belief system that I don't have. And we both have quite a solid moral framework. They're very different ones. And she would say to me, well, this fits into my view of the world this way, therefore I think we should do this. And I'd say, well, okay, but that's not a universal point of view. Mine is different. And we'd have quite stringent discussions about these things.
Civil?
We remained civil, although she stomped a bit. She's a believer, basically, and I'm not. So that means that you see the difficulties in life that befall people and the very strange situations that befall people in a different light from someone with my convictions. So we had to work around these things also while getting the carpets cleaned, So...
So you were quite aware, I think, of your sister and writing what was also her story.
Yes.
While you were writing it, and to what extent did you have to bear that in mind? Did you feel like you had to hold back at all?
Because why would you write a memoir if you're going to hold back? As I said, I think I felt very strongly I had a contract with myself and with anybody who might ever read it, and I wasn't planning on really people reading it. It was, it went in a drawer for 2 years. But I felt that I owed, if I was going to do it, it had to be honest. It had to be the way I saw it. What I did feel strongly about was that on the page is not the place to settle any scores. If you've got scores to settle with somebody or with yourself or with whatever powers you believe in, you don't do it on the page because nobody wants to read that. I mean, you can write that way for yourself. And I had cancer 2 decades ago. And when I was having treatment, I was offered workshops to write because that's something that helps people to try to make sense of the experience, which is quite confronting. I was already doing that, so I didn't take advantage of the workshops because I was afraid I might try and run them, actually. If I went in there, which would not have been good. But I was already doing it, and there's nothing wrong with that kind of writing. It can save your life. It really can. But if you're wanting to do something, because as I said, I like the process, and I like the quality of writing that's focused on process. And I wanted to tell a story that would also have a form and a voice and a choice of point of view and a way of telling. And the way I chose was to write it quite spare. There are things I didn't say, not that I blotted anything out, but I wrote it kind of straight, without too much embellishment, because I couldn't see a better way to tell the story.
And I think what comes across from the reader's perspective is that you don't spare yourself, but it doesn't seem in any way false, So it seems fair, and certainly it seems from a reader's perspective exactly the way that you describe it, that you're trying to be honest with your writing.
Yes.
I think readers can tell, can't they?
I think you need to give your readers' intelligence a lot of credit because they will read it most often. the way you intend it, if you're clear enough about your intent. I think so.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yes.
They're on your side, aren't they? They want to hear.
So. I think so.
Yeah.
And I mean, not all of them, but that's normal. That's normal. But
reads.
I think that but I think the thing is that you need to give your reader credit. You need to do it that way. And I really did not want to be harder on anyone else in my book than on myself, because there were no villains in there. My mother had a personality disorder. This is a dreadful thing to have lived her whole life with. If anyone was unhappy in our story, and we all were, but I suspect the most unhappy of all was my mother. The one who suffered the most, I suspect it was her. And it takes a long time to work through these things, and you work through it not on the page, but somewhere else. But I felt sad when my mother passed on, because I felt that she lived a life that had much more potential than she'd had the means to develop. And there was misfortune for me in being the child that she lived through vicariously, and a child who had a extremely bizarre childhood, to put it nicely. But in a way, it wasn't personal. That sounds strange. She was my mother. But what happened to me because she was my mother was not because I was who I was. It was because she was who she was. And part of that she couldn't help. It's always a dilemma with that type of situation to know, is a person afflicted with that type of thing responsible for what they do? Not responsible, partly responsible? It's a mood question. You cannot know. And you can exhaust yourself in resentment and recrimination and something or other, those sorts of things. There's no need for that. It was what it was. And I didn't feel, and I think my sister felt differently, I did not feel that what was visited upon me as a child, which was not always good, far from it, was quite often quite bad, that it was personal. And I think that's how I survived. It wasn't because I was the child I was. It was because I was the child in the position I was in.
You respond with tremendous generosity to that situation. What is it, do you think, that some people can speak about it the way that you are, and some people will hold it forever, and it will be, a cross that they will bear that they can't move past? What is it? Why is it that some people respond to the same thing so differently, do you think?
I think you need to find a way to work through it. Because I think a childhood like that leaves you very lost. And as a young person at university and the years shortly after that, I did feel lost. I didn't feel like I was in a position to define what I wanted from my life. And I actually didn't feel that much was available to me, which was silly because I'm a privileged person. I got an education. I came from a country that was rich. I'd had many, many advantages. But I couldn't see a way forward for myself. I was quite desperate. And I think you need to find a way, whatever that way is, and people find it in different places. People climb mountains, and they work for a good cause, and they go into politics, or you can do therapy. You can do any number of things, but you find a place where you can commune with yourself and come to terms with what you are and the part that you think your upbringing had in forming that person. And if there's something you want to change and you think you can, then you work on that. But I think you have to do that at some point if you're going to look on it with equanimity. But as lost as I felt in my 20s, I felt if I do not find a point where I can look at this with some equanimity, I'm just not going to go on. And that's not, you have one life to live, and that would have not been good at all. And I don't mean I was running around and it was crisis point all the time. I just mean I couldn't see a way forward. And I think you have to find through something a way to work through that very defining experience, which is a childhood that's modeled by things that have nothing to do with who you are. That's the difficulty. We're very careful now to look at children and grandchildren and say, this child has a talent for this. How can we foster this? My mother said, this child has a talent for various things, or if she doesn't, she's going to get it quick smart or she'll be in trouble. And then whatever I did that I excelled in, it was my mother's, because I don't think she could see the difference between us. I don't think she saw me as a person. So I had to come to terms with that.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? I'm interested in that idea of her not being able to see you as a person. How did that...
Well, it played out bizarrely because she always insisted that my sister and I excel in school and in various other things. We did everything from, figure skating to downhill skiing and music and stuff.
Had she excelled herself?
She did, but she didn't go to university. I think there were straitened circumstances in her family at the point where she might have gone. I suspect also her very difficult character got in the way of a lot of the things. She was a very talented musician. I think she had a beginning of a sort of career happening there, and I think it fell apart because she was extremely difficult. So when I grew up and I was less malleable, I was less around and able to accomplish the things she set for me, I was going to go to university, and I think she began to realize that I was going to escape and she wasn't going to have someone who was going to be... It was very vicarious the way she lived through this. And so she decided to enroll at university the same year I did. And we have the same first name. My first name is Jacqueline. My name's Jacqueline Victoire, and I'm called Vicki. Her name's Jacqueline Yvonne, so it was Jacqueline Y and Jacqueline V. And my mother does not go unnoticed on a rather small campus in Alberta. And that was a really strange introduction to university. So I think at that point, she realized that we were separate, and she began to really cut herself away from us. She began to, both my sister and myself, she began to really dislike us. And actually she came to hate us, I think, because we were free of her and we weren't part of her doing what she needed. It was complex and it was very dark because she was mentally very unwell, very unwell.
Does it feel like taking a risk publishing a book like this?
No. And I don't mind. I mean, people have said to me a couple of times, is it okay if I ask you a question about the book? Yes, I put it out there. You ask me what you want. I may not be able to answer satisfactorily for you, but go ahead and ask. I just felt it was a story that had kind of, in a society where people get older, where we don't do very well at recognizing mental illness and helping people with it, where we have had problems with childhood abuse and trauma, I think it's worthwhile trying to tell a story. And the other thing was, we had, which was defining for me in thinking I would write this, we had moments where things were so ludicrous that my sister and I would just sit down and laugh until we wept. I mean, sometimes we just wept, but that was different. But there were times when things were so funny. I mean, we went to visit my mother in a hospital at the beginning when she had broken her hip, and we went to the desk in the hospital. We said we were there to visit my mother. We said her name, and they said, "Why are you here?" And we said, "Well, we're her daughters." And the nurse didn't even look up from her papers. She just said, "No, you're not." And my sister and I are standing there, and we were pretty sure we were there. And, and this was funny. And these conversations that were so ludicrous had happened because my mother fabulated. She told people amazing stories, including that I was her daughter who disappeared decades ago in Colombia. And she'd had Interpol looking for me. Now, the neighbors around the property, she told them this. And when I went calling to introduce myself, they wouldn't open the door, because here I was, it was not sure I was a good person, Colombia, Interpol, you're not thinking good things. And, so there you are.
It sounds as though there's more memoir for you to write? Are you inclined, do you think, to write some more?
I would actually like to, because recently I've become aware that my mother's father was not who I thought he was. He was French. I remember he died when I was 8. I adored him. I remember when he spoke English, he had a French accent. And the story we had in the family, and I know my father believed this story, was that my grandfather had immigrated to the US from France with his parents when he was a small child. And this only later, when I was much older, did it seem strange to me that a child who had immigrated to the US still spoke English with a French accent, because there's a kind of assimilation in the US. In Canada, it's a bit different. We're happy for people to keep on speaking their languages, and usually their English is perfect too. But we don't have a policy of, a young man in a supermarket in Montana in the US one day said to me, "Oh, that looks like a foreign name on my credit card." And I said, "Well, define foreign." But, and he said, and I said, "Yeah, it's French." And he said, "Do you speak French?" with a really suspicious look. He was about 12. And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "My parents were German." He said, "They spoke German. They've forgotten it now, and I don't speak a word." And he was proud. And I thought in Canada, we don't actually have that. Canadians sound like Americans to a certain extent, except I will now say "about" for the benefit of the microphone. But we do sound the same, but there's a different ethos. We're not the same people, Yeah. But I have become aware that my grandfather did not immigrate from France. He actually came from a very long line of people from Quebec who belonged to one of the indigenous groups in Canada called the Métis, which is that means mixed in French, descendants of French fur traders and a few Scots who got it in the mix, from the 17th century, who married Native American women and have a culture which goes on to this day, and which I knew nothing about. And that's one grandfather, but it means I have a connection to a lot of things that I didn't think I did. And I think this is quite fascinating at my age to become aware that I'm not completely the person I thought I was from the point of view of my ascendants.
Is that research going to be doable?
I think so. I mean, there won't be people who knew my grandparents, or even people who can tell me who actually knew this, because my grandfather apparently turned his back on that heritage because there was very vicious prejudice against anyone who had any native North American connections with First Nations people. And he wanted to be a businessman. He was a mover and shaker. So he turned his back. And there was this other story about who he was immigrating from France. And I think that's interesting. I don't know that I'll find anyone who can tell me who knew. I suspect that he just told this new story. I'm not sure my mother knew. I'm not sure. My father certainly did not know.
Sounds
so
fascinating.
I'd like very much to look into it, and I'd like to write about what we think about as we get older, because I think when you get a bit older, you are more interested in what went before you. And also, I come from a family where everything was lies. My mother fabulated, so nothing was true. She would tell people things. She told that nurse that said we didn't exist. No, she told the physio in that hospital that no, actually, it wasn't that there were no children. There were actually 18 children. So she told people different things. And so I grew up with the idea that, I didn't need a philosophy class at uni to teach me that truth was a variable concept. I already got that. But it's interesting to know that in a family where basically my bottom line was, it's probably all lies. Everything I hear here, I have to figure out what's true. The one thing I did accept was the story of my grandfather because of the accent, because I knew he spoke French. And that's the biggest falsehood of all. And it came from him, from what I can tell. And I really want to figure that out. And interview people and see people in my situation who found out that they have this connection, which was hidden for quite some time for obvious reasons. Yeah. So that's my next thing. So I'm going to go to North Dakota and stomp around in the snow and see what I can find out.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
In your Stella acceptance speech, you said, this is a time when speaking truth seems more important than ever.
Yes.
And there was quite a lot of nodding in the audience.
Oh, was there? Okay. I'm gratified.
And I wanted to know what you meant by it specifically.
Well, I don't want to rant, but...
You're in a good place for ranting.
I said I don't want to, but I'm going to do it. I'm quite horrified by the fact that nobody seems preoccupied with telling the truth. That particularly in North America, we have people in highest office who seem to use words to mean something that they want them to mean. And I don't think you can say exonerated is the one that really, my hair caught on fire. I don't think you can say exonerated when the document in question says, we just didn't have enough evidence to convict you. That's not what exonerated means. And I believe that if we're dealing with this kind of slippage of truth, and I think I thought a lot about it writing a memoir, because what I wanted was truth. So when I see that, and when somebody says alternative fact, what is that? That doesn't exist. If it's fact, it's fact. If it's not, it's something else. You don't have an alternative.
Yeah.
And it's very dangerous in politics, in anything, in relationships, if you put a valid thing on the same plane as one that is invalid. If you give that invalid thought or concept the same press time or TV time or discussion time as the valid concept, if you elevate it to the rank of something you should actually be considering. And that's kind of what horrifies me about political discourse for the moment. And I think it's true of other kinds of discourse. That's my rant.
I think you're speaking the truth, definitely. This is what we're all believing. We are going to open up for questions in a second, but I just thought before we did, I wondered if you could tell us a few books that you love, have always loved, reread, would hand to us and say, you must read this. Anything that sits there near your desk that you turn to frequently?
Well, often I do read fiction, and often if I read fiction, the book I love is the last one I read and really, really liked.
That's
and
great.
This year I've read several things I very much liked. I read Shell by Christina Olson, which I think is a beautiful book and has a lot to say about the place of arts in society, the worth of that, what it means to a society. It takes place during the building of the Opera House. And for those of you who've read it, you'll know that's wonderful artisan, the young artist who comes from Sweden to make a glass sculpture for the Opera House. It's a beautiful book, and it speaks about things that are much beyond those preoccupations. It speaks about art in public life and the difficulty of making a place for that and the worth of that. And I liked very much. I also read Rick Tchaikovsky's novel called Dark, which is a beautiful novel, and I very much like Rick Tchaikovsky. He's a rare book dealer in London. I believe he's American by origin, but lives in London.
Can you spell his name for those of us who are taking that?
Gekoski, I believe. Yes, first name Rick. And he wrote a wonderful book. He writes books about being a bibliophile. And he wrote one called Outside of a Dog, from that old comment by, I think, Harpo Marx or someone that said, outside of it, what was that quote? I'm going to misquote it now.
Yeah, it's
Outside of a Dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside of a Dog, it's too dark to read, or something like that. Yeah.
So good.
So his book was called Outside of a Dog, and that was a book about books, and that was charming. But he did write a novel when he was already in his 50s, I believe, called Dark, about a gentleman whose wife dies, about grief, about how you assume it, about how different family members feel grief differently and deal with it differently and misunderstand each other. It was an absolutely beautiful novel, and I liked that one very much. It was called Dark. That was the gentleman's last name, D-A-R-K-E. Yeah, it's a good book.
Fantastic.
Very good book.
Wow. Okay.
And I read poetry all the time. That's mostly what I have on my
Really? Have you got a
bedside
favourite poet or two?
I like Philip Larkin. I like
That makes
poets who...
sense, doesn't it?
I like poets who speak to the immediate. You know, I love Mary Oliver. I like Billy Collins. I like those kinds of poets who speak about not everyday things, but find beauty in everything that we see, that we all have access to. But what comes from what they say about it it opens out into a lot more.
Do you think we'll see a volume of poetry from you?
Oh, I'm hoping. Yes.
Fingers crossed.
I have a collection of love poetry almost ready to go.
Oh, wow.
And the working title is Foobar, but I'm not sure that's one I'm going to keep. That'll depend. We'll see. We'll see where it goes.
Oh, fantastic. To look forward to. Okay, so we've got roving microphones. So they'll go to our first. We can see you at the back.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I just had a question about, well, because you talked about your journey and that you've been writing since you're about 35 or 40 and you'd written this book and put it away in the drawer for 2 years. What was the moment or the impetus for actually sending it out and getting it published?
Well, I think I opened the drawer and thought, I really need this space, you know? And I think, I'm not really making a joke. I'm answering your question seriously. And I thought, this is kind of silly because I did enjoy writing that book. I think it's okay. And then I was on the web that night and I was looking at the newsletter from Varuna Writers House in New South Wales. And they were having a thing called a focus week for memoir writers. And Varuna is a great place. It's Eleanor Dark's former house. And there are 5 bedrooms, and they have focus weeks where 5 writers doing the same type of thing can go and live for a week, have a couple of seminars with someone. Patty Miller did the memoirs seminars, and then have a lot of time just to write. And you get together at dinner time and you discuss what you're doing. And they're actually wonderful weeks to spend in a writer's house. And it was about 10 at night, and applications closed at midnight. And I thought, okay, we're going to do this. So I very quickly did the application and sent the manuscript or part of it and got myself a place to my surprise. And then I went up, met a lovely writer called Carol Major, who was the person who was my consultant up there. And she said, okay, I think you should send this somewhere. And I said, well, I don't kind of do that much. And she said, I think you should. And I said, okay, there's a thing called the Finch Memoir Prize because I'd read a couple of those books and I liked them. I'd been interested in memoir for a long time. And I said, okay, I'll send it there. And I did. And when I put it in the mail, I remember calling a friend and said, I just won. She said, what did you win? And I said, I just won because I put something in the mailbox. And then all this happened.
And then you did win, and then you won again.
Yeah.
It's a great answer.
So serendipity. You know, I opened a drawer.
And then
We went from there.
she needed the space.
I was wondering whether your sister has read the book and whether it changed your relationship in some way.
That's a very good question. When I'd finished writing the book, and I had actually put it in the mail to the memoir competition that Finch Publishing held, my sister came down to Australia to see me for a week. And I thought long and hard about this before because I hadn't told her that I was writing a book. And although I love my sister dearly and I believe she loves me too, we're very, very different people. And we have spent half a century on different continents. We haven't really been part of each other's lives. And that's a kind of unbridgeable chasm. Unfortunately, it's very difficult. But when she came down, I decided I would say to her, because we would inevitably talk about that 6-year period when we did this stuff together, and I would say to her, off the cuff, as you do, by the way, I wrote a book about that period. And I thought it's going to go one of two ways. She'll say, I want to read that, or she's going to say, that's nice, what's for lunch? And I thought, either way, I'm good. She's welcome to read it. And she said, I'd like to read it. I said, fine. I said, I've sent it off somewhere. I'm giving it you to read. It's an honest account of the way I saw that period. And I said, I hope, you may hate it. I fully expected she'd hate it because we have a different point of view on things. But she read it and she laughed at a lot of the right places, which I found wonderful. And she said to me when she'd finished reading, she was very gracious. She said, I remember all those incidents. And then she looked at me suspiciously and said, were you taking notes? And I said, no, but some of that stuff was just so raw or so vivid or so funny. It's like it's etched in my brain. I can just remember the dialogue. I'm not making it up. It's there. I wasn't taking notes. And she said, what's funny is I remember those episodes. I can remember the different things that you talk about happening. And the episode itself will be the way I remember it. What's very different is how you saw it and how you write about it, how you felt about it, because that's completely different. And I was quite prepared for her to say, I hate this book. She didn't. She said, I think it's a good book. I think you should try and have it published. I see things very differently. So I don't think she was actually a big fan of what I wrote. She did see the humor, which was part of what I did want to have in the book, because there were funny things, and I think it helps to know that occasionally there's black humor and you just go with it because it's the best thing you've got happening that day. And yes, I think she must have had some mixed feelings, but she was very gracious about it. So she did read it. The one thing I did not want was by some fluke, because I was not, any writer who's sitting where I'm sitting will say to you, I did not expect this. And that sounds kind of twee, but believe me, it's true. And but I just thought, on the very off chance, if I were to publish a chapter of this somewhere in a literary magazine or something, I do not want to have to say to my sister, well, heads up, there's a book out there about you, I didn't want to do that. I wanted her to read it and to discuss it if she wanted to, and to say to her, I'm not changing it because this is my truth. And if you will have a different truth, and please write your book, and I will champion that. It'll be a different book.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's perfect, isn't it? That's the ideal that you'd hope, really, isn't it?
Well, I thought her response was very gracious. I was not expecting that to be that way. I wasn't.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion. I just had a question, probably builds on what you've been talking about a little bit. You talked about variable truths, and I'm just wondering how you found your truth in writing the memoir, and how you gained confidence in telling that, whether you started at the same point or whether that changed along that journey of writing.
That's a good question. I don't think it changed much. I think when I was faced with that situation of my father in this dire kind of condition, of this situation where my parents had isolated themselves from the world and put themselves in really difficult situations with legal things, and it was kind of a crisis. And I think I had a point of view on that, which was that these people are my parents. I would like to do the best I can to sort this out in spite of the fact that they have excluded me from their lives, because they are my parents. And I feel that it's something I need to have a really good go at for myself as well as for them. And I believe I went into it with that point of view. I don't think I changed. I think I went into it not expecting anyone in the equation to change as a person. I did not expect my mother to suddenly fall into my arms and say, you know, my poor daughter, I'm so sorry for everything that happened, or whatever. No, she waved at the snowbank outside the window of her hospital room and said, "Are you not too chilly coming to all of this?" To which I replied, "No, Kathmandu," meaning the shop I went to, where I bought a bunch of thermal stuff. And she thought I meant that I was spiritually enlightened. And that's not what I meant, you know. So it was just, the humor was there in these situations, even when they were difficult. I think that got me through it, but my point of view, I don't think changed a lot. I think that's what made the writing of the book kind of easy from a certain point of view. Because, and it's probably my fault, a fault of me, perhaps, that I didn't evolve more. But I feel my sister, it was the same thing. She had a framework that she went into this crisis with. I feel she still has the same one. And I feel that, unfortunately, we perhaps still have the same distance between us.
Hi, Vicki.
Hi.
Thank you for writing this book. On the page, your mother is the mirror image of my grandmother. It was spooky. My question is, I can tell from the book that your childhood was quite challenging, as well as the 6 years, the period
Yes.
that the book took place over. And now your beautiful book has won 2 prizes. And I'm just wondering if that has had any impact on, or how you reconcile, I guess, the wonderful result of your writing has also been a result of this incredibly hard time for you.
Thank you for that question. I think the truth is you have to have something to write about. And I think if you have a story that might resonate, because we all have the same human dilemma to go through when we live. How do we love someone? How do we live ethically? How do we define what living ethically means for us? How do we get through the difficulties of losing love, of being ill, of growing older, of losing people who die, whom we love? We all go through these things. And I think if we're able to find a way to use our story to illustrate a way of looking at some of those problems, that it's a wonderful thing if you can share it with people and if it resonates.
Lovely.
I'm blinded by the light. Are you still out there?
Is there another question? Excellent. I am actually interested in whether or not this changes your sense of identity now at this point, being a writer and
You mean
being on stage talking about
the
your book.
validation? Yeah. Look, it does, because I find this absolutely wonderful to have people. I've been surprised since I won the Memoir Prize and the book came out, and I realized there were people buying my book who didn't actually know me, who didn't actually feel they had to. And that for me is still a marvel. I'm just so happy about that. So I think what it does change for me is people often say the Stella Prize changes lives. I think it does, to the extent that I feel very energized, which at my age is a really good thing, to go ahead and investigate the next thing, which I hope will be a book, the thing I spoke about, which may not. It may end up being a different book, but there is a book in there somewhere. And I feel very motivated to do it, which I'm not sure was actually the case as much before. I would have continued writing because I've always done it, and I find it, as I say, the process a wonderful thing. But now I think I perhaps have more focus on an actual goal that I would like to attain.
Oh, this is good news for us, isn't it? We have to finish up now. We've got Hill of Content are selling books which you can get signed, and Vicki will be around answering any questions and autographing. Please buy up big time. And please thank Vicki Laveau-Harvie.
Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.